North Korea is sending a second wave of rocket troops to help Russian forces fight Ukraine. Kyiv has hit a rocket and aircraft factory inside Russia, and Donald Trump has fired his first warning shot to Vladimir Putin since being inaugurated as US president. Kyiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news and analysis from the war in Ukraine. We're starting today with reports that North Korea is preparing to send more troops and weapons to help Russian forces in Kursk, where they've been battling Ukrainian forces who are clinging on to a pocket of territory which they seized in August. Reports have emerged from various places, including US and Ukrainian and South Korean intelligence officials, all suggesting that Pyongyang is planning to send more troops and more weapons. They've sent 12,000 soldiers already, and the latest estimates suggest that about 1,000 of those North Koreans have been killed, that 3,000 of them have been wounded, and an assessment by the Institute for the Study of War, which monitors this conflict very closely, says that on that trajectory, all the North Korean soldiers would be wiped out, dead or injured, by mid-April. However, Kirilo Budanov, the head of Ukraine's GUR military intelligence service, has said that about 150 KN-23 short-range ballistic missiles are due to arrive in Russia from North Korea, and he said that North Korea is also planning to double the number of self-propelled howitzers and multiple launch rocket systems. He said they've already sent about 120 M1989 self-propelled howitzers. These are known as the Koksan guns, and about 120 M1991 MLRS rocket launchers. Now, the Koksan self-propelled guns have a phenomenally long range. Depending on the ammunition used, it's between 40 and 60 kilometers. That's interesting because it's, significantly longer than the equivalent guns both in the sort of NATO or indeed the South Korean arsenal, which, depending on whether it's regular high explosive or rocket propelled artillery rounds, it's normally between 30 or 40 kilometers. It shows perhaps what the requirement is for Russia and the requirement is for those North Korean troops who have been engaged in really fierce fighting in Kursk, to try and support those soldiers with long-range artillery and rocket fire, particularly those Koksan guns used to try and suppress enemy fire, for counter-battery fire, to try and suppress Ukrainian guns whilst remaining out of range at a safe distance. And we've seen a couple of reports coming out of the Ukrainian side, both of the conflicts and indeed of the prisoners they've captured. One sort of mildly amusing but poignant anecdote: the 95th Separate Air Assault Brigade of Ukraine released interviews with its soldiers who were involved in capturing a North Korean prisoner of war. One of them saying that when they found him, this particular prisoner was holding a grenade, a knife and a sausage, and when they asked him to put down everything he was holding, he put down the grenade and the knife because they were weapons, but refused to put down the sausage because it was food. They allowed him to hold on to it, they said. And then subsequently, one of the things they said that he asked for from them was access to romantic movies. There's a little bit of sort of exoticism, Orientalism almost, in the way these soldiers are describing their encounters with North Koreans. But of course, that is because these soldiers have emerged from the hermit kingdom, and so little was known before about, how they would fight, how well they would be equipped, and indeed how they would behave. And on a more serious level, we've heard that they have been good soldiers, they've fought well. There have been mixed reports about how well they've been equipped, some suggesting that they're wearing body armour, for example, that is far too big for them, that their uniforms don't fit, that they're wearing three sort of summer coats instead of having proper winter equipment. Another Ukrainian unit, the 8th Regiment of Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, recently released some drone video, heavily edited drone and soldier cam, like a sort of GoPro on a soldier, showing a battle between their soldiers and North Korean forces. They said it was a 9-hour battle in Kursk where they killed 21 North Korean soldiers and some 40 were injured. But they do concede in this video that actually the North Korean assault forced the Ukrainians to withdraw from their position. So just evidence of the nature of the fighting. Extraordinary videos emerging this week, as all weeks. We've seen Ukrainian Hinds attack helicopters skimming treetops. We've seen extraordinary footage, or appears to be a phone camera capturing the very moment a Ukrainian drone hit that factory in Smolensk. Which brings us on to Ukraine's latest long-range strike in Smolensk. Russia said Ukraine fired around 55 drones on the night of Donald Trump's inauguration. Ukraine said Russia replied that same evening with 131 drones, some of them decoys, some of them real, and 4 missiles. Now, the Ukrainian strike against this factory, it's a factory around 170 miles north of the closest Ukrainian territory. We understand it makes both Sukhoi aircraft and Kh-55 and 59 missiles, so an important part of Russia's war machine, an area one might have expected to have been well defended by air defences. And what is extraordinary, footage does appear to have emerged from somebody at the factory, which captures the moment one of those drones flies overhead and crashes into the factory clearly ablaze. We've also seen an attack that same night on an oil depot in Lysky in Voronezh. So again, fitting into that wider pattern as we've discussed before. We've also seen extraordinary footage of what appears to be a Ukrainian soldier shooting down a drone with his assault rifle. This has been the war of drones, but ultimately it's also a war of soldiers fighting in bunkers and trenches. And this was just a little clip that showed those two worlds colliding in extraordinary fashion. The final thing we're going to talk about today is Donald Trump's first warning shot to Russia. And this is really the first time Donald Trump has explicitly addressed the conflict in Ukraine since his inauguration on January the 20th. And what he did is he shared a message on his social media platform, Truth Social, which I thought I would read out now so that we can sort of pay attention to exactly what he said. He said, "I'm not looking to hurt Russia. I love the Russian people and always had a very good relationship with President Putin. And this despite the radical left's Russia, Russia, Russia hoax. We must never forget that Russia helped us win the Second World War, losing about 60 million lives in the process. All of that being said, I'm going to do Russia, whose economy is failing, and President Putin a very big favour. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse if we don't make a deal, and soon I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Let's get this war, which never would have started if I were president, over with. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. It's time to make a deal. No more lives should be lost." Essentially, Trump is saying two things. He's saying he wants a deal, and he's making an implicit threat to Vladimir Putin that if a deal is not forthcoming, that he's going to impose even more sanctions on Russia. Interesting that he began it with all of that talk about how he loves the Russian people. He paid homage to the sacrifice that Russia made during World War II and reminding the world that Russia was America's ally against the Nazis during World War II. Interestingly, that figure Trump used of 60 million Russian war dead is extraordinarily high. Now, estimates of the Soviet Union's losses during World War II do vary hugely. But for example, I think the Encyclopedia Britannica puts the figure at about 18 million. Academic studies have sort of put it between 26 and 27. Most estimates of total losses, total war losses in World War II suggest that that figure is around 60 million, including military and civilian. So to suggest that Russia lost 60 million people itself is perhaps Trumpian exaggeration, but it doesn't really matter, because what he's saying is that Russia paid a huge price to win a war with America and with the Allies, and he's evoking that shared history of fighting on the same side, perhaps to try and prove that he isn't dyed-in-the-wool Russophobe. And we know that because he's called President Putin a genius and he's hailed him as savvy in the past. So he's simultaneously making a friendly overture to Russia, but nonetheless following it with that threat. The question is, are sanctions or the threat of sanctions going to make any difference to Moscow? The message we've heard from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is that they see a small window of opportunity to negotiate with America under President Trump, and that was suggesting that window has emerged only because he is in power. Of course, many people have pointed out since Trump made this overture that Russia is already perhaps the most sanctioned country in the world. Ukraine's allies, led by America and the European Union and the United Kingdom, have imposed a raft of sanctions against President Putin, against his closest allies, and against Russian companies involved in the war effort. Is it going to make a difference? The narrative from Moscow is that its economy is robust, that it is surviving. But interestingly, there has also been a report from the Reuters news agency this week suggesting that that pretense is wearing thin, and that actually people close to Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin are increasingly aware of the strain that their economy is under. Also worth noting what Marco Rubio, new US Secretary of State, has said. He said he wants a sustainable peace in Ukraine that doesn't lead to just another war starting in 2 to 4 years' time. And what President Zelensky of Ukraine has said, he said that any peace deal must be a victory for Donald Trump, not a victory for President Putin. That leads us very neatly into our questions, because the first one today is, how do we get a peace that stops Russia rearming? And of course, Marco Rubio saying he wants a peace that avoids another war starting in 2 to 3 years' time. Well, fundamentally, it'll be very, very difficult to stop Russia rearming. And we've touched on this before. Russia's economy is Russia has sort of mobilized a war economy. It is in full conflict mode. Its factories are at full tilt, producing armaments and ammunition. It is churning soldiers into the military at an extraordinary rate. So unlikely that the West can stop Russia rearming. Clearly, you can look back to examples from history after World War I, when the West tried to stop Germany rearming. That didn't work. What they might be able to do, whilst they might not be able to stop Russia rearming, is provide sufficient deterrence to stop Russia invading again. And that's really been the consistent message from President Zelensky. He wants to join NATO because, of course, if Ukraine is a member of NATO, then any attack against Ukraine in future would become an Article 5 conflict. It would become an attack, and any attack on a member of NATO requires the rest of NATO members to rally to its defence. The next question is, who is winning? We get this a lot, but I want to answer it again because it's such a simple question, but it's quite a complicated answer. Day to day, Russia is gaining ground in Ukraine. Day to day, they have been recovering ground in Kursk as well. Day to day, Russia is paying a huge price for this conflict. They are losing upwards of 1,000 men a day, sometimes almost 2,000 men a day, dead and wounded. But they seem to be able to replace those losses. Ukraine is losing perhaps around 250 people a day by some estimates. They are struggling to replace those soldiers, the dead and wounded. So on a linear trajectory, if things were to continue today as they have been going over the last few months, indeed years, then Russia would win. But the important point is that conflicts are rarely ever linear. The Allies, the United Kingdom, the United States, the Allied powers were losing World War II until about 1943. And indeed, though many of those same allies were winning their war in Afghanistan, they defeated the Taliban, and they were winning that conflict until about 2008, 2010. And fundamentally, ultimately, they lost that war because they retreated in chaos and the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan. So that is just to say, wars are not linear. Right now, Russia is winning, but it's really about who can sustain this level of attrition the longest. And I'm reminded of a line from a Hemingway book about how a character went bankrupt. He said, gradually, two ways, gradually and then very suddenly. And that is often the way these things can turn. It's quite possible that one side may collapse, particularly if there is a significant shock to either side. And both sides are, I think, particularly alert to the fear of big shocks with the inauguration of Donald Trump and his bombastic way of doing business and his determination to secure a swift end and a deal. Question number 3, why isn't there a United Nations coalition going into fight on behalf of Ukraine like there was in the Gulf War. That's the first Gulf War. In 1990, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution effectively authorizing conflict to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The very simple answer is because Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. So you will never get a Security Council member with a veto approving a resolution to allow United Nations members to go to war against it. So that is why, at the moment, the United Nations is effectively the Security Council, a lame duck, really, in terms of this conflict. As ever, thank you very, very much for watching. Remember, you can join Frontline for exclusive and early access to new analysis and videos. We'll be discussing in this week's exclusive video, we will be looking at Russian naval activity, particularly the Royal Navy's extraordinary response to it in recent weeks. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer as many as possible, and look forward to seeing you again next week.